It began quietly, far too quietly for a moment that would soon rip through every layer of the federal justice system. Saturday, November 29th, in the cold pre-dawn stillness, Fort Dix looked almost peaceful from the outside. The fog crawled low across the ground, and the first traces of morning light were still hiding behind the horizon. Inside, the prison hummed its usual mechanical rhythm. Buzzing lights, distant radio chatter, the metallic click of doors locking and unlocking. No one inside had any idea what was coming. The collapse didn't start with a shout or an alarm. It didn't start with a confrontation or a cell disturbance. It started with a file 17 seconds long, appearing where it absolutely shouldn't have appeared. No watermark, no traceable origin, no official explanation. Just a cold, grainy piece of footage uploaded with surgical precision and a chilling message attached. This shouldn't exist. Before we go deeper, before we go back to June, July, and the moment everything started collapsing, do one thing. Like this video, subscribe to the hidden evidence, and hit the bell. Because what comes next isn't speculation. It's the chain of events that led to this moment, and it's darker than the footage you just saw. All right, let's go back to where it all began. The clip opens inside a corridor that even veteran officers rarely walk through. A Level 3 restricted zone sealed by biometric locks, monitored by 2 clearance checkpoints, and protected by protocols that have never been violated in the facility's history. The walls look different here, cleaner, smoother, like the area is used for administrative access rather than inmate movement. A single emergency light flickers at the far end, casting long, broken shadows that sway across the floor. Then Diddy appears. He steps into frame with a calmness that makes no sense. No guard behind him, no restraints on his wrists, no sign of an escort team. He moves like someone who knows exactly where he is going, someone who has walked this hallway more than once, someone who has memorized every inch of this forbidden path. He glances over his shoulder not in fear, but as if confirming that the moment is timed perfectly, and continues forward. He stops near a reinforced door, labeled in bold red letters, "Restricted access, authorized staff only." A place no inmate in Fort Dix has ever entered, especially a high-profile one under strict zero-tolerance supervision. Then the footage cuts for half a second, and when it resumes, things are different. Diddy is now leaning closer to the corner, head lowered, body angled. A figure steps just inside the frame, a shadow. Tall, broad, unrecognizable. Only part of a sleeve is visible, but that sleeve is what sent investigators into freefall. Because the sleeve has a stripe identical to the kind worn on the uniforms of senior correctional officers. That single detail, barely visible, half hidden in the dim light, was the detail that turned the footage from suspicious into catastrophic. The two figures lean in. Diddy lowers his voice, or appears to. The shadow shifts like someone passing something small, something quick, something they don't want the camera to capture. The emergency light flickers again, and the shadow seems to flinch, almost as if they're trying not to be seen. Then another impossible clue. On the far wall, for less than a second, the reflection of a second shadow passes behind them. Too fast to identify. Too smooth to be an officer on patrol. It looks like someone standing just out of frame, someone watching, someone waiting. And then the clip ends. 17 seconds. But those 17 seconds detonated every safeguard the Bureau of Prisons claimed to have, shattered every rule Judge Subramanian set on October 3rd, and exposed a possibility far darker than anyone expected. Diddy was not just moving freely, he was being allowed to. When the footage reached SDNY, the morning air inside the courthouse felt heavy, electric, as if the building itself knew something unprecedented had arrived. Judge Subramanian's clerk said he watched the clip in complete silence, his eyes narrowing each time the emergency light flickered, each time the shadow shifted, each time the reflection moved across the wall. On the third viewing, the judge's hand tightened around the pen he was holding so hard that the clip-on cap snapped clean off. He didn't speak. He didn't look away from the screen. He didn't blink when Diddy stepped toward the corner. But the moment that striped sleeve appeared, a change came over him. His jaw set, his posture straightened. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on the desk, eyes locked onto the frozen final frame, as if trying to pull a confession out of the pixels themselves. The room was so quiet his clerk could hear the slow, controlled sound of the judge's breathing. Shifting exhale, stretching longer. Inhale, tightening shorter. It was the expression of a man who understood something horrifying. This wasn't an inmate sneaking into a hallway. This was a breakdown from the inside. Someone with authority. Someone with access. Someone helping. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but edged with something dangerous, a tone usually reserved for cases involving corruption or federal betrayal. "Prepare the order," he said. No deliberation, no briefing, no waiting for Fort Dix to respond, no giving the facility a chance to explain. The emergency sentencing authority, rarely used, almost unheard of in modern cases, was activated within minutes. Because if a judge allows a sentence to stand after footage like this, the public loses trust. The courts lose credibility. The entire system loses legitimacy, and Subramanian understood that better than anyone. In that moment, the October 3rd sentence died. Inside Fort Dix, word of the leak spread like wildfire. Officers exchanged frantic looks in break rooms. Supervisors were pulled into locked meetings. The warden barked orders nobody could follow fast enough. Someone demanded the visitor logs. Someone else demanded the escort schedules. Someone started tearing through motion-activated camera reports. Someone else replayed the hallway footage from the past 48 hours in slow motion. But none of them could answer the only question that mattered. How did he get there? And worse, who was with him? Outside, social media erupted in the same way it did with the previous leaks, but louder, faster, angrier. People slowed the clip, brightened the shadows, circled the striped sleeve, rewound the reflection. Some pointed out the missing escort. Others analyzed the emergency light flicker. Some claimed the angle of the camera meant the footage wasn't from an inmate phone. It was from a device placed intentionally by someone who knew exactly what they were recording. Every major outlet broadcast the footage within hours. Every panel discussed the possibility of inside involvement. Legal analysts declared the footage devastating. Former officers said the presence of a uniform sleeve meant the system is compromised from within. But the judge didn't need any of that commentary. He had already reached the conclusion that mattered. And now, before we go back through everything, the first cracks in June, the escalations in July, the warnings in September, the turning point in October, the strict ruling on October 3rd, and the slow, undeniable collapse that followed, there's one thing you need to understand. This new footage wasn't the final straw. It was the moment the entire structure snapped. Long before today's collapse, before the 17-second clip shattered the federal system, before the judge's pen snapped between his fingers, the story had already begun unraveling. Not this morning, not last week, not even last month. The real descent began quietly, almost invisibly, months earlier back in June, when the first whispers started spreading through circles that usually never speak publicly. June was when former associates, old employees, and people who once stood close to Diddy began surfacing with stories no one expected to hear out loud. At first, it was subtle comments during interviews, hints dropped on podcasts, brief mentions buried in longer conversations. But the tone was always the same. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. And these weren't anonymous rumors floating online. These were names, faces, voices, people who worked inside his world, walked inside his houses, traveled with him, watched him as success and secrecy blended into something darker. Investigators always listen when multiple stories point in the same direction, even if those stories don't contain evidence yet. And by late June, those whispers reached federal ears. Quiet calls were made. Files were opened, not charges, not cases, but folders marked preliminary interest, the bureaucratic equivalent of a storm gathering far away but heading toward shore. Then July came, and the whispers turned into thunder. The first major shift happened when Homeland Security unexpectedly executed coordinated searches at two separate locations connected to Diddy properties that were supposed to be extremely secure, extremely private, extremely controlled. But federal agencies don't knock unless they're certain. And what they were searching for wasn't ordinary contraband. It wasn't drugs. It wasn't weapons. It wasn't cash. It was digital. Hard drives, surveillance systems, old phones, cloud access logs, anything that could reveal patterns, behaviors, movements, communications, the kind of things people delete when they're hiding something, the kind of things agencies recover when deletion isn't enough. Those raids sent shockwaves through the industry. News channels erupted, analysts speculated, former associates started reaching out to each other quietly, trying to understand what was happening. And behind the scenes, prosecutors began watching carefully, tracking every development as the public pressure grew. But the biggest shift wasn't visible to the public. It happened inside Fort Dix. Because around this time, federal officials overseeing Diddy's confinement began noticing smaller irregularities, things that didn't make sense. A misplaced form, an escort log missing a signature, a hallway camera showing a blind spot where it shouldn't. Nothing large enough to trigger alarm bells on its own, but patterns matter in federal supervision, and this pattern was beginning to look intentional. August brought a new complication. Reports surfaced that Diddy wasn't adjusting well to confinement. Minor violations, disagreements, requests denied, behavior flagged multiple times. Again, nothing severe on its own. But combined with everything that came before, it painted a picture of someone testing boundaries. And testing boundaries inside a federal facility is the fastest way to draw the attention of higher authorities. September was the turning point, the month when investigators realized that whatever was happening behind the scenes was bigger than anyone expected. This was when internal memos began circulating between agencies, when emails started using the words "monitor closely," when quiet conversations were held in small rooms with closed blinds and no cameras. But the public had no idea. On the outside, everything still looked like scattered stories, vague statements, incomplete reports. On the inside, something was tightening. Prosecutors were preparing. Agents were connecting dots. And the judge overseeing Diddy's confinement had already received multiple updates warning that stricter supervision might be necessary. Then came October. In the first week of October, a restricted report arrived on the judge's desk detailing several violations inside Fort Dix, the kind of violations that don't happen by accident. Unapproved movement, incorrect escort procedures, a missing timestamp on an internal record, and most importantly, a warning that Diddy had somehow accessed or approached areas he was not authorized to enter. This was the first time the federal system officially admitted they were losing control of him. October 3rd became the defining moment. Courtroom insiders say Judge Subramanian entered that day with a calm expression, but a stiff posture, like a man preparing to deliver a decision he didn't want to give, but had no choice. The room was filled with the low hum of reporters whispering, lawyers adjusting papers, officers standing rigid along the walls. When the judge spoke, the tone was final, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. He ruled that Diddy would serve a 50-month sentence under strict, zero-tolerance supervision. No unsupervised movement, no unapproved contact, no special privileges. Every escort documented, every step monitored, every request evaluated through the highest level of scrutiny. Those in the room said the judge leaned forward slightly as he spoke, emphasizing each condition like he was laying bricks in a wall designed to keep future violations from slipping through. "This supervision will be absolute," he said. "This structure will not be compromised." It was supposed to be the safeguard, but what no one in that courtroom knew was that the safeguard was already failing. Not because of Diddy alone, but because Fort Dix itself had cracks no one admitted publicly, cracks no one wanted to acknowledge, cracks that would ultimately grow into the disaster unfolding today. By mid-October, internal tension at Fort Dix was becoming impossible to hide. Officers whispered about inconsistencies. Supervisors quietly reviewed logs late at night. A few staff members started speaking in coded terms, worried that someone inside the system was bending rules. Rumors of compromised protocols floated through shifts like smoke. And yet, despite all the warnings, despite all the signs, despite all the evidence that something deeper was wrong, the worst violation, the one that would send shockwaves through the entire country, hadn't happened yet. Not until November. The first leaked video dropped earlier this month, showing Diddy walking through the media library with no escort in sight. That alone was enough to spark outrage. Legal experts tore into the footage, Social media exploded. Analysts compared the hallway layout to prison maps, pointing out that the area was restricted. Then the second video emerged, showing Diddy laughing quietly in the chapel corridor, slipping into a dark corner to meet someone out of frame. That clip shook the system, not because of what he did, but because of how easily he did it. The public demanded answers. The judge felt the pressure. Fort Dix scrambled to investigate, but even then, no one expected what happened today. Because today's footage wasn't just a violation of procedure. It wasn't just unusual behavior. It wasn't just another inmate in the wrong place. Today's footage revealed a breach involving someone on the inside. Someone with access. Someone whose uniform carried the very stripe that represents authority. Someone who stepped into a corner where cameras shouldn't exist and made a mistake big enough to be caught. And that was the moment the entire structure snapped. By the time the sun finally rose over Manhattan, the air outside SDNY carried a strange heaviness, like the city had sensed something was shifting before anyone else realized it. The streets were already filling with reporters, vans parking on corners, microphones pointed toward the courthouse steps. No one had been told exactly what was happening, but the leaked footage had moved too fast, too violently. Everyone knew there was no way the judge could ignore it. Not after yesterday, not after last week, not after the disaster unfolding inside Fort Dix. Inside the prison, everything had spiraled into a kind of silent chaos. Officers were ordered into immediate briefings. Supervisors were told not to leave their stations. The warden, normally composed, walked with the rigid tension of a man bracing for impact. Phones rang in every office. Radios buzzed nonstop. Everyone kept repeating the same questions. Who recorded the clip? How did Diddy reach the level 3 zone? Why was the shadow wearing a striped sleeve? And the question no one dared to say out loud. Who else was involved? And in the center of it all, Diddy sat in his cell, staring at the wall, hands clasped tightly as if he already knew what the judge had done hours earlier. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. Even the officers who arrived to escort him said he looked different, not angry, not defiant, but hollow, like a man who understood that something was coming, something irreversible. When the chains were locked around his wrists and ankles, he didn't flinch. When the belt tightened around his waist, he didn't react. When the final metal click echoed through the cell, he closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough for the officer beside him to feel a pressure in his chest he couldn't explain. The walk from the cell to the transport van was silent, except for the clinking of restraints. Inmates pressed their faces to small windows as he passed, their expressions a mixture of shock, curiosity, and grim understanding. They had seen the footage too. Word spreads inside prisons like oxygen. Some whispered to each other, "It's done. He's finished. Life. He's getting life." But no one said it loudly. The convoy pulling out of Fort Dix was heavier than the usual transport, 3 vans, 2 SUVs, federal marshals positioned like a moving fortress. The road to Manhattan felt unusually long, every mile passing with a kind of suffocating tension. Diddy sat between 2 marshals, his head lowered, fingers trembling slightly against the chain around his waist. No one spoke. When the convoy reached the courthouse, the noise outside was deafening. Cameras flashed like lightning across a dark sky. Reporters pushed against barricades, shouting questions over each other, voices desperate to grab even a fragment of the story. What were you doing in the restricted zone? Did a guard help you? Who was the person in the corner? Do you think your sentence will be increased? Are you prepared for life imprisonment? But Diddy didn't look up. Even as marshals guided him through the crowd, even as flashes exploded inches from his face, even as people screamed his name, he kept his eyes on the ground, expression drained, as if he were walking into a place he already knew he wouldn't walk out of the same way. Inside the courthouse, the air felt colder than usual. Courtrooms are silent by nature, but today's silence was different, tense, electric, suffocating. A row of journalists sat ready, pens hovering over notebooks. Prosecutors whispered quietly among themselves, expression hard, focused. Federal officials from Fort Dix were present too, sitting stiffly, their faces carrying the weight of a facility that knew it had failed in a way that couldn't be hidden anymore. And then the door opened. Diddy entered slowly, chains clinking softly with each step. His shoulders were slumped, his posture defeated. He didn't scan the room. He didn't look for familiar faces. He didn't even turn toward the cameras. He simply walked to the defense table and lowered himself into the chair, with the exhaustion of someone who had run out of strength. Judge Subramanian entered moments later, and the transformation from his usual composed demeanor was unmistakable. His expression was sharp, eyes hardened, the weight of responsibility pressing visibly on him. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and stared at the stack of printed stills spread across his bench frames, pulled from the footage leaked this morning. He didn't begin with formalities. He didn't waste a second. "Mr. Combs," he said, his voice steady but colder than anyone in the room had ever heard. "The court has reviewed the footage released this morning. We have analyzed its location, its implications, and the severe breach it represents." He lifted one of the frames, a grainy still showing Diddy standing near the restricted door. "This area is off limits to all inmates. The facility has confirmed that no escort logs exist for your presence here." He then raised another frame, Diddy, leaning with the shadowed figure. "This contact is unauthorized. This location is unauthorized. In the presence of what appears to be a uniformed sleeve suggests internal compromise." He paused. The silence in the courtroom felt like pressure on the lungs, as though everyone were holding the same breath. The supervision order issued on October 3rd was designed to prevent precisely this outcome. You were instructed, under strict zero-tolerance conditions, to follow every rule outlined by this court. He lowered the papers and leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed directly on Diddy. "That order has been violated." Diddy swallowed, eyes glistening slightly, but he didn't speak. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him, knowing there were no arguments left, no defense that could explain the impossible. The judge continued. "The Bureau of Prisons has acknowledged they cannot account for the footage. They cannot explain how you reached this area. They cannot identify the person in the corner. They cannot explain the breach." He exhaled slowly, as if pushing out the last fragment of hesitation from his body. "And when the system cannot uphold the sentence, when supervision fails, when public trust collapses, the responsibility of repair falls upon this court." The room froze. "Therefore, effective immediately," the marshal near Diddy stepped closer. "This court upgrades your sentence." A journalist dropped their pen. "From 50 months, Diddy's breath shook, to life imprisonment." Gasps erupted behind the press row. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." A reporter covered her mouth. Even the prosecutors looked stunned, despite knowing this was the only logical outcome left. Diddy's shoulders collapsed forward like his entire body had been struck. His head dropped. Tears slid silently down his face, dripping onto the chains across his lap. His breathing hitched, his chest tightening as the weight of the words settled over him like a final, immovable verdict. The judge wasn't finished. "You have forfeited your right to appeal," he said, voice unwavering. "The severity of the violations, combined with the public collapse of prison supervision, leaves no legal foundation for reconsideration." Another marshal stepped to Diddy's side, placing a firm hand on his arm for stability. He looked like a man aged 20 years and 20 seconds, eyes empty, jaw trembling. "This is the ruling of the court," the judge said quietly. The courtroom didn't move for several seconds. No papers rustled, no chairs shifted. Time felt suspended, the gravity of the moment too dense to break. Finally, the marshals lifted Diddy gently but firmly, guiding him toward the door. Every chain rattled faintly, echoing like the final punctuation on a downfall no one could have imagined months ago. As he passed through the doorway, reporters leaned forward, desperate to capture his final expression. But his face was hollow, his stare unfocused, his spirit drained. He wasn't the powerful figure who once controlled rooms with his presence. He wasn't the celebrity who lived above consequences. He was now inmate Sean Combs, a man leaving one world behind and stepping into another he will never escape. And as those heavy doors closed behind him, the world finally understood the truth. Everything that brought him here, the whispers in June, the raids in July, the violations in October, the footage today had been building toward this moment. The collapse was inevitable, and now it is complete.